Good morning. Over the last few weeks, we've been looking at the life of Joseph, how he started as the center of attention at his family, and how he antagonized his brothers to the point where they sold him into slavery, and how when he became a slave, he was framed for attempted rape and sent to prison. Life's been pretty hard for Joseph. And today we're going to continue the story and look at how things really hit rock bottom, but then they rebound. Now, just a quick note. This morning I'm looking at 2 whole chapters of text, and it's going to be a bit much for me to read through the entirety of the 2 chapters. So I'm going to paraphrase, and then at some key points I'll read directly from the text itself. So the story opens in chapter 40. Joseph has been put in prison, and he is asked to care for the needs of a couple of VIP prisoners. These are personal servants of Pharaoh's that have somehow gotten in his bad books and have ended up in prison. One is his cupbearer, and the other is his chief baker. Now, one night, the cupbearer and the baker both have dreams that disturb them. You have to remember, in the ancient world, dreams were seen as omens from the gods, and so they think that the gods are communicating with them. Now, in normal life, they'd have been able to consult some of the wise men or magicians at the court. But of course, they're in prison and they don't have that. So they're feeling dejected. They're supposed to know something and they haven't figured out what that means. Joseph, caring for them, picks up on the apprehension that they feel. And so he asks, what's wrong? And they say, well, we both had dreams. And at this point, Joseph says, hey, God can interpret dreams. Tell me what they mean, what you saw. So the cupbearer goes first. He had a dream, and I'll spare you the details. But Joseph says what the dream means is that after 3 days, you're going to be reinstated to your position. And then Joseph says, please remember me when you go back to Pharaoh. I've been wrongfully convicted. Please bring up my case. The chief baker, of course, seeing that this was a really good interpretation, says, hey, what's my dream mean? So he tells his dream to Joseph, only it's not so good. Joseph says that he's going to be put to death in 3 days. Well, 3 days pass, and guess what? The cupbearer is reinstated to his position, just as Joseph had said he would be. And the baker is put to death, just as Joseph had said he would be. But the cupbearer doesn't remember about Joseph. Now, Proverbs 13:12 says that hope deferred makes the heart sick. And I'm sure Joseph felt a little bit of that as days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months. He realized that the hope that he'd placed in this cupbearer to bring up his case to Pharaoh was for nothing. And so he would feel really difficult time holding on to hope. But you know what? Joseph never seems to slide into despair. How can we tell? When we look at his behavior towards the prisoners, it tells us something. Joseph, as a young man, had dreamed dreams, and the insights from those dreams are what actually had needled his brothers into selling him into slavery. Not to condone what his brothers did to him, but it was his behavior that ruptured those relationships that were already tense because of his father's favoritism. Now, Joseph used the insight from his dreams to needle his brothers. But it seems that he still must believe that he has the ability to interpret dreams. And the fact that he's volunteering to do that to these people means that he must still put stock in the dreams that he had in his youth. Furthermore, in chapter 41, when Pharaoh tells his dreams to Joseph, we'll see that Pharaoh tells Joseph 2 dreams that have the same meaning. And Joseph says, because you dream 2 dreams that have the same meaning, it means that God has really made up his mind that this is what he wants to do. Now, in chapter 37, Joseph had 2 dreams with the same meaning. And so he must believe that this is exactly what God is going to do. He's made up his mind and he's committed to doing it. Only life really doesn't look like he's committed to doing it. Everything in Joseph's experience tells him otherwise. And so he has this faith in who God is, but at the same time, he has these serious doubts that are the result of his life circumstances. It reminds me a bit of the story of Mother Teresa. Now, Mother Teresa died in 1997, but in 2007, a collection of her private correspondences were published in a book. It gave a rare glimpse into the life of a woman who was very private. Mother Teresa had a profound sense of God's calling on her life when she was young, telling her to go to the least. So she went to Calcutta, and from there, silence. She lived the rest of her life without any sense of God's presence with her, to the point that she sometimes confided with other people that she felt like a hypocrite, like she was going through the motions. Well, was Mother Teresa a hypocrite? No, I don't believe that she was. She was enduring something called the dark night of the soul. That's something that we go through in which we receive a test of our faith. And the test of our faith is meant to help us understand what our motivation is for following God. Am I following God simply because I get a spiritual rush out of it? Because I hope to get some benefit out of it? Or am I just truly devoted to God? Do I have a devotion that helps me withstand even when I have doubts? You see, faith isn't the opposite of doubt. Faith is a devotion that trusts God even when circumstances seem to suggest that He isn't going to do what He said He's going to do. Now, at this point in the story, when Joseph is speaking to the prisoners, and later when Joseph gets called to Pharaoh, we see a humbler Joseph than the Joseph we read about in chapter 37, the Joseph who dreamt dreams and bragged about it to his brothers. He's careful, both when he talks to the baker and cupbearer and also to Pharaoh, to give credit to God for the interpretation of dreams, rather than using it as something to puff himself up. Joseph has become the person that God needs him to be to do the job that God wants him to do. So what happens? Well, 2 years have passed since the cupbearer has been reinstated, and Pharaoh has 2 dreams one night. In the first dream, 7 fat cows come up out of the Nile, and then those 7 fat cows are followed by 7 skinny ones that eat the fat ones but still look like they haven't had a meal. After that, he has another dream in which 7 ears of grain appear in one stalk, and then suddenly they're good-looking ones, and they're displaced by withered ones. And he's disturbed because he doesn't know what this means. He asks the magicians and the wise men, and they can't figure out what these dreams mean either. Just then, the cupbearer remembers Joseph, and he says, "Oh yeah, boss, about that. Remember when I was in prison a couple of years ago? Well, I met this guy. He's a Hebrew, and he can interpret dreams." So Pharaoh calls for Joseph, and Joseph comes to him, and Pharaoh explains. Well, Pharaoh first starts by asking Joseph if he can interpret dreams, and Joseph's response is telling. In 41:16, he says, "I can't do it, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." By that, he doesn't mean that God's going to give Pharaoh necessarily good news, but Pharaoh is distressed because he doesn't know what these dreams mean, and he's going to help him understand what it means. So Joseph interprets the dreams. They both mean the same thing. They mean that there are going to be 7 years of plenty, but followed by 7 years of famine. And then he goes out of his lane a little bit, and he starts to tell Pharaoh what Pharaoh ought to do. He says, "Take a wise man and put him over the land of Egypt as a commissioner to collect 20% of the produce so that there can be a strategic reserve in place to withstand the time where there's not going to be very much." And so Pharaoh thinks this is a great idea. In 41:37-40, he says, "The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and all his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, 'Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?' Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you.'" So the humbled Joseph instantly becomes second in command of all of the land of Egypt because God has prepared him for the job. Now, God's not just using Joseph's hardship in order to make his character right to do the job. He's also doing it to bring himself glory. Huh? What do you mean by that? We often fall victim to the idea of great man history. In great man history, we look to the outsized personalities and give them too much credit for the things that they do in all of history. We talk about how Alexander the Great conquered the known world, about how Caesar Augustus brought peace to the Mediterranean, how William Wilberforce dismantled slavery, or how Churchill stared down fascist aggression. History remembers the great men, but in the Bible, history remembers average people. People like you and me, called to do remarkable things through the power that God gives them. You can read the story of Gideon, the youngest person from the most insignificant family in Israel, and yet he puts the Midian horde that's oppressing Israel to flight. We might think of David, a shepherd boy who becomes Israel's greatest king. You might think of Peter, an uneducated fisherman who ends up spearheading the global church movement, or Saul of Tarsus, the greatest persecutor of the church who ends up becoming its greatest missionary and theologian. God uses regular people to do extraordinary things for his glory. When Joseph talks to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh hears the wisdom that he has, Pharaoh credits God. He says, "Is there anybody like this in whom the Spirit of God is?" So God wants to glorify himself. Is it because he's insecure or on some sort of power trip? No, God wants to glorify himself because he loves us. You see, we live in a broken world and none of us can save ourselves. It's only God who can save. And when we find ourselves seeing the glory of God, seeing in practical examples the way that he can save people, how he can transform them, how he can change them, how he can make them live in a different and more exciting way, it's when people see that for themselves that they come to God because they've seen it in somebody else's life, and now they understand that God can save them. So when God receives glory, people come to God to be saved. And so God's not out for his own glory as an end in and of itself. He's out to love us and save us, and his glory is the way that he does that. Now, our circumstances are probably a bit different than Joseph's. Most of us aren't foreign slaves living in some place, but we are regular people called to live in extraordinary times. Maybe your wearying circumstances are God preparing you to do something amazing. Now, by amazing, I don't necessarily mean something that's highly visible, but that you can do something through the power of God that you couldn't do in any other way. God has given us superpowers, if you will. Now, I don't mean the kind of superpowers you'd see in a movie or in a comic book like super strength or X-ray vision. What I mean is that God has empowered us to do things that we cannot naturally do for ourselves. It might be a person who learns to be generous even when they don't have much themselves. A person who learns to forgive other people even when those people have treated them shamefully and aren't even asking for forgiveness. It could be a person who stubbornly holds on to hope even when everything in their life tells them that they have no business having any hope. God empowers us to do these things, and if we lean into these giftings, then our lives demonstrate his power to save. God is using your hardship to equip you so that your life can be an example to the people around you. It's also important to remember that hardship can be a sign of God's care and love for you. The writer of Hebrews tells us that God disciplines us for our good in order that we might share in his holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. Now, we often think of the word discipline as like God getting even with us, punishing our bad behavior. But I challenge you to think of it a little differently. Think of an athlete who submits to the discipline and rigor of their training in order that they can be the best competitor that they can be. And in the same way, discipline is the rigor that God asks us to undergo so that we can become the kind of people who can demonstrate his saving power to the world. And so, through the discipline that Joseph endures, He is able to save the land of Egypt and his family. And through the discipline that we endure, God is preparing us to show his saving work in our own lives. I hope that puts a different perspective on the difficult things that we have to walk through.